Okay, get started. So hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Aaron Essery. I am the Assistant Extension Specialist for Viticulture and Enology here at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, Oklahoma. Today, we're going to talk about enological tannins in winemaking. So this is a pretty big and broad and dense topic, and we're just going to take it slow. We're going to try to chug through it as best we can, and if at any point you have questions or comments or ideas, just blurt them out, and we will have a Q&A at the end. But let's start with what are tannins. So tannins are a group of organic, bitter, and astringent compounds found in nature. They're naturally produced. Tannins are found in a wide range of plants, including grapevines, persimmons, cloves, cinnamons, tea, walnut, cranberries, blueberries, bark, leaves, fruit, stems, roots. They're everywhere. You see, plants produce tannins as a secondary metabolite, usually as a feeding deterrent to keep, pests and bugs and animals from eating them. So tannins are found in almost every single plant. I don't know of a plant that doesn't produce a tannin. So I'm hesitant to say they're in all plants, but they're pretty much everywhere in nature. So tannins in winemaking. So we use tannins in winemaking to give an astringent, puckering mouthfeel to wine. Tannins add body and complexity to wine. They also are used to remove proteins and improve color. And we'll talk about that with the different types. They can even be used to chelate metals and inhibit enzyme activities in the wine. Tannins are very, very useful for red wine making. Now, most white wines actually avoid tannins. Because with white wines, most of the time you want a lighter, crisper wine, and tannins are not for that. Sometimes you can make a tannin addition to a white wine, especially like a sacrificial tannin addition, which we'll talk about. But for the most part, tannins are used for red wine making. Okay, so how are enological tannins made? Well, they're extracted from plants. From the best I found and researched, a plant material is ground up and then is basically macerated or percolated in hot water. And sometimes this may include a solvent to help with the extraction process. And I was reading and learning too, the solvent used and the method used to extract a tannin will also influence the potency and the purity of that tannin too. So a tannin is pretty much extracted and then dried into a powder, but sometimes a tannin can be in a liquid form, and I'll show you both later. So enological tannins. Not all tannins are created equal. That's why there's so many of them. Different plants produce different tannins, and then those different tannins make different attributes to your wine. So that's why you got to know your tannins, know what you're using, know where your tannin was sourced, how it was sourced, and again, what you're trying to do to your wine. Okay, so this is the beginning of trying to tease out the different types of tannins. I've pretty much put 3 types of tannins on here, but there are more tannins than this. But just for the sake of simplicity, we'll just start here. There's gallotannins, elagitannins, and condensed tannins. And you may have even heard of these already. Now, within these tannins, there's hydrolyzable tannins and non-hydrolyzable tannins. Hydrolyzable tannins contain a sugar molecule, usually glucose, whereas a non-hydrolyzable tannins do not contain a sugar molecule. So they're still tannins, but the type of tannin is either going to be hydrolyzable or non-hydrolyzable. Let's start. Yeah, let's work through this chart slowly. So here's pretty much a tannin chart. Let's start on the very far left with gallotannin. But before we even get there, if you look up on the top left corner of the screen, you'll see a phenol. You see a phenol. That's a phenolic compound. A phenol or a phenolic compound is pretty much a catch-all in a lot of things to do with winemaking. Like, yeah, that wine has good phenolics. Well, phenolics encompass everything. Phenolics are color compounds, phenolics are flavanones, phenolics are tannins. You see, so a phenolic is a catch-all for a lot of stuff. Well, a phenol is also a building block for a tannin molecule. So if you start on the far left with galantannin, you can see that phenol ring is gallic acid. A couple hydroxyl molecules are added and an oxygen and another carbon. I don't know the exact chemistry behind it, but you can see a phenol combines and morphs and makes gallic acid, which then combines with a sugar molecule, which is that trapezoid looking thing, to create a galantannin. You see, so you see the phenol ring, and then you see that trapezoid looking thing. That's a glucose molecule. Galantannin is gallic acid with a glucose to make galantannin. If you jump over one to elagitannins, you basically have two phenol rings come together with an extra hydroxyl group and some carbons. That forms elagic acid. Elagic acid forms with a sugar molecule, usually glucose, to form elagitannin. You see, so we have two different types of tannins that look very similar, but there's gallic acid, galantannin, and then elagic acid, elagitannin. So those are your hydrolyzable tannins. Let's just skip over complex tannins for now, because I really don't understand it fully to explain it, but you can see kind of the molecular arrangement. If you jump over to the far right, you see a condensed tannin molecule. And you see these phenol rings combine together to form a flavone. Those flavones combine together to form condensed tannins. So you see there's no actual sugar molecule in the condensed tannin. It's just all flavones, and then flavones are composed of phenols. They all combine together to form a condensed tannin. I don't exactly know the science behind it, but that's, from what I understand, how it works. And again, we're going to skip over complex tannins today. I need to learn more about it, but you can see a complex tannin is essentially a combination of both, but we'll save that for another day.
Okay.
So make sure everybody can see this over here. Again, just a little further, I tried to trace this back as far as I could, and I traced it back to a phenol ring and a flavonoid. You can see here on the right, the chart, you have a flavonoid skeleton, and just the arrangement of those molecules, of those hydroxyl groups, of those phenols create different flavonones. I mean, flavin, isoflavonone, flavin 3, anthrocyanin, which is a color compound, you see is a big conglomeration of phenols. And then if these flavins ever come together to form long chains, that's a condensed tannin. They can even form with color compounds to form proanthocyanin tannins, which is another type of tannin. It's a big sloppy mess, but for simplicity's sake, we can revisit this later, but for now, we'll just stick with elagitannin, galantannin, and condensed tannins. But this is kind of the molecular arrangement of these tannins or flavins. Okay, so let's just dive into, and I'm trying to move so you can see. Let's dive into galantannins. So a galantannin comes from gal nuts and sumac leaves, from what I've read and researched. Again, gallic acid is the precursor, and this is all produced in the plant. So the plant produces these gallic acid, these galantannins. The use for galantannins in winemaking is to help protect against enzymatic oxidation, for the most part. Galantannins are usually added at crush, fermentation, or early in the winemaking process. This is especially helpful if you have fruit that is suffering from botrytis rot. So let's say you harvest and you got some rotted fruit. If you crush that and then make a galantannin addition, there's a really good chance that galantannin is going to inhibit any enzyme activity or microbial activity that could spoil your ferment, you see. Now, at the same time, galantannins will also inhibit lactic acid bacteria, which is used to carry your wine through malolactic fermentation. But still, you can inoculate with lactic acid bacteria later. Galantannin will disrupt lactase, which is an enzyme produced by botrytis. And again, galantannin is used as like a feeding deterrent. So the plant produces tannin. The plant produces these secondary metabolites, usually as a feeding deterrent. And when they're extracted for enological purposes, they help with enzyme activity. They help to suppress enzyme activity, again, from what I understand. So that's basically a galantannin addition in a nutshell. You use them early, and it helps to protect against enzymatic oxidation. Moving on to elagitannins. So elagitannins are from oak trees and oak barrels, specifically Quercus, and also chestnuts. Elagic acid is the precursor. So elagitannins in winemaking, oak barrels, or oak alternatives, oak chips, oak staves, oak zigzags. If it's oak, it's elagitannin. And so when you think of oak, when you think of elagitannins, think of oak barrels. And these are good. Elagitannins used to improve mouthfeel and color stabilization. I was reading more about elagitannins, and something they do help do is with chemical oxidation. They can help chelate free radicals and chelate metal ions, specifically copper and iron. Copper and iron are a precursor for chemical oxidation. If you leave a wine in the open with ambient air, it'll get oxidized. It's because that oxygen is hitting the copper and metal ions and forming free radicals, which cause oxidation in your wine. Elagitannins will help with that. It'll help prevent some of that oxidation. So oak, I'm a big fan of oak, and this is another reason to like oak. It's because elagitannins, they improve your mouthfeel, they help with color stability, and they help with oxidation. So yeah, if you're using oak alternatives or oak barrels, it's a great deal. Condensed tannins. Okay, so now we're into condensed tannins. Condensed tannins are mostly derived from grape seeds, grape skins, mimosa bark, and then also something called the corbacho tree. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but the corbacho tree is a source of condensed tannins as well. Most commercial tannins you buy in the store or offline or from a producer are condensed tannins. I think the number is like 90%, if I remember correctly. So 90% of the tannins we use in winemaking are condensed tannins. The uses for condensed tannins in winemaking is to improve mouthfeel and aroma, color stabilization. You can also precipitate out proteins with condensed tannins, and it helps with mercaptan removal. So if your wine is a bit sulfury or a bit garlicky or a bit funky, a condensed tannin might help with that. If your wine is very turbid, if you have a lot of protein in solution, you can hit it with a condensed tannin, and it'll pull that protein out of solution, and then you can rack off of it. So these are condensed tannins. Just know your difference. Elagitannin, galactannin, condensed tannins. They're different uses, different reasons, and there's more than that, but for simplicity's sake, we'll just stick with those three today. So styles of tannins. What we just discussed with types of tannins, now we're talking about styles of tannins, what the tannin is going to do to the wine stylistically. There are sacrificial tannins, cellaring tannins, and finishing tannins. And each three of the tannins we just discussed can be each one of these styles of tannins as well. And this is where the confusion sets in and why things get messy, because one tannin can serve as all three, if you know how to use them and you know what you're using them for. So a sacrificial tannin does not actually add anything to the wine, but rather gives themselves up by combining with substrates and dropping out of solution. So if you're using a condensed tannin to pull protein out of solution, that's a sacrificial tannin. If you're using a galactannin to inhibit enzyme activity, and then you rack off of it, everything's going to fall out of solution, that's a sacrificial tannin. Cellaring tannins are added post-fermentation during the cellaring process to develop body, aroma, mouthfeel, color stability. I think when I think of tannins, and when most people probably think of tannins, they probably think of cellaring tannins. I'm putting this powder into my wine, going to dissolve it in as best I can, then I'm just going to let it sit for months. That's a cellaring tannin. It's a classic tannin addition. It improves mouthfeel, it improves body, it'll improve color stability. That's a classic cellaring tannin. A finishing tannin is usually added weeks or days before bottling and is meant to just add character to a wine that might be lacking. In other words, a finishing tannin is kind of a final tannin addition to just spruce up the wine. Maybe it's like, I wish this wine had more aroma, condensed tannin. I wish it had a little bit more body, a little bit more bid palate, a little better finish. finishing tannin. You put finishing tannins in literally days before bottling, and you say, okay, that's it, and then you bottle it. So these are your styles of tannins that we use in winemaking. Here are some real product labels I pulled offline, and I figured we can just kind of go through them, read about them, and then see their uses. So let's start on the very far left column. Under tannins, we see FT Rouge Soft. So starting there, it says this was derived from exotic South American Quabiacho tree. Well, Quabiacho tree condense tannin all the time. Used in red wines to contribute soft, round body, promote natural color through sacrificial tannin activity, reduce the potential for bitterness characteristics. So this looks like to be a condensed tannin that's used sacrificially to pull proteins or bitter compounds out of solution. I see a chat. I'll get to it after this in 1 minute. The rate, they recommend 5 to 25 grams per 100 pounds of fruit. That's, 25 is basically a 5-fold increase of 5. So I'll get to dosage in a minute and how that can make a difference. But to use this, you add it to onset of fermentation. You sprinkle the powder in directly into the must, and you incorporate it with a punch down. So this first one looks to be like a sacrificial tannin, used to remove bitterness and help with color stability. I got a chat. That's on tannin additives with power. Hey Dan, let me address your question here in a minute. So FT Blanc, derived from oak gal nuts. Well, a gal nut, oak is elagitannin, a gal nut is gallitannin. It's probably one of the two or both. Used in white or rosé, help to protect against oxidation, enhance texture and mouthfeel. So this is one, it's likely a gallitannin because of the gal nut, and it's used to help against oxidation. You just dose it in to the ferment, and then rack off the gross leaves. So this left column are sacrificial tannins. The middle column, let's look at tannin complex. Derived from traditional oak and exotic South American Quabiacho tree. Well, oak is always going to be a elagitannin. The Quabiacho tree is going to be a condensed tannin. This might be a combination of the two. How to use it? Use at the first or second racking after primary fermentation. Mix with your wine as you transfer. So this is definitely a cellaring tannin. We're using after fermentation, going to incorporate it. It's going to enhance tannin structure, aid in color stability. Classic cellaring tannin. Tannin refresh. Derived from untoasted French oak, elagitannin. If it's oak, it's elagitannin. Because of its origin and method of production, it is highly light oak nuances, smoky. So it's kind of telling you the characteristics there. What it does, protects against oxidation during the wine aging, increases complexity, aid in color stability. Classic cellaring tannin, good for your wine. To the far right is a finishing tannin, tannin rich, 100% derived from 100% toasted French oak. So even though it's a cellaring tannin, even though it's a finishing tannin, it's an elagitannin because it's 100% oak. It goes through the attributes that it does to your wine. If you're using, there's your rate of dosage. You mix as a powder thoroughly during the racking process. Add no later than 3 weeks before bottling. So this is finishing tannin. That's going to add a little bit of, vanillin and a little bit of body to your wine. You put it in, mix it, and then bottle. Let me address this question real fast. So Dan asks, what's your favorite tannin additive, liquid or powder? I really only used liquid once. I've mostly used powder. And I don't know if I have a favorite tannin per se. Tannin élevage or uva tannin, tannin complex, tannin rich. It just depends on what you're trying to do, but I think I prefer powder over liquids, and that's just me. But yeah, I think I like powder tannins. But you got to know them. You got to know which tannins you're using and why. Okay. So tannin products. This brings me to the producers. So these producers that make tannins grind up plant material, extract tannins, and some will run trials themselves in-house to see what it does. But sometimes they can either sell a specific one type of tannin, or they can mix powders together and create some new type of tannin and sell that. It's you just really have to know and read the labeling, even call the reps. You can call the, if there's a phone number there, call them and ask them, hey, what do you recommend this tannin be used for? Because it's imperative to know what you're buying and why are you using it. As I just mentioned, some tannin products might be a mix of both hydrolyzable and non-hydrolyzable tannins. If we look back, where's my mouse? At Tannin Complex says it's derived from oak and the quabracha tree. Well, oak is a lagitannin. The quabracha tree is a condensed tannin. So that's a mix of both a hydrolyzable and non-hydrolyzable tannin. It's just a different way to do things to your wine. And then always read the recommendations from the producers. So before you buy a tannin, know what you're trying to do. And then when you find what you're trying to do, read on the product. What is this for? How does it, is it a sacrificial tannin? Is it a cellaring tannin? And just go from there. And then also do small scale trials. I do not recommend opening a pound bag of tannin and pouring it all into a 500-gallon tank. Do like a bench trial. Pull out 100 milliliters, take a teaspoon of tannin, mix that in, see what that does, and then scale up. Dosage of the tannin makes a difference as well. As we saw on one package, it said 5 to 25 grams. I mean, that's a 5-fold increase. So dosage will make a difference in the effect of the tannin as well. So I recommend pulling out a 100, 200, 300 milliliter sample, trying a different dosage here and there, mix that up small scale, see what that does to your wine, and then you can scale up to 100 gallons, 500 gallons, The physical and chemical characteristics of the wine make a difference too. So, if your wine is early on in the winemaking process, maybe there's still some solids that haven't precipitated out yet, that your tannin will probably affect that differently than a finer wine that's 2 years old, that's been racked, it's been clarified, it's not turbid. The tannin will affect those two differently. So where your wine is in the winemaking process too will make a difference in the tannin, or the attribute of the tannin. So to make a tannin addition, for the most part, if you're using it early, you just sprinkle the powder into a fermenter and you punch down or pump over during fermentation. If you're adding it after fermentation, I recommend pulling off a bucket of wine, mixing the tannin into the bucket, get it as incorporated as you can, and then pouring that bucket mixture into the tank. And then you can circulate it with a pump and hose if you have one, or circulate it somehow. Or then even after you mix that, possibly follow it by a racking, just to help either incorporate it better, or sometimes the tannin doesn't dissolve fully and it, slides down to the bottom of the tank. You can rack off and go from there. So tannins don't appear to affect pH, titratable acidity, volatile acidity, residual sugar, alcohol percentage, or yeast performance. These are things that tannins don't affect. Even though hydrolyzable tannins have a sugar molecule present, I don't think it's going to affect sweetness too terribly much. Maybe a little bit, but I think it's very, very minuscule. Just FYI. But it doesn't seem to affect yeast performance, even though tannins are like a feeder inhibitor. Yeast or a fungus, and doesn't seem to affect them much. Tannins don't affect pH, they don't affect TA. Cool, so know your tannins. Again, on the left, this picture is powders of tannins, and I can see 5 different types of tannins in that picture alone. You see, so even though they're all powders, each one of those tannins is different, and it's going to do something different to your wine. Know what you're buying, know why you're using it. On the right is a picture of a liquid tannin. I think I've used liquid tannins once in my life. I don't know. They're just, it seems weird pouring liquid into liquid. That's just me. But nothing wrong, no rhyme, no fault, no foul, no wrong, no reason. Just know what you're using and why you're using it. So with that was pretty much a crash course into part 1 of tannins. There's so much more out there past what I just discussed, but I hope this was a good starting point for you nonetheless. And if y'all want, I will stop the recording and we can open it up to some Q&A.